John stepped into the house at 10 minutes after 5 p.m., earlier than usual. The aroma of food being prepared wafted through the air, leading him straight to the kitchen. Amara stood over the stove, her movements swift and precise as she walked to finish dinner. Good evening, she greeted, glancing at him briefly with a soft smile. John, however, wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. Amara, why isn't dinner ready by now? He asked, his tone sharp. Amara paused, startled by his tone. I'm almost done, John. You came back earlier than usual. I wasn't expecting you this soon. That's no excuse. He shot back, his voice rising slightly. It's your job to ensure there's food on the table when I get home, no matter what time I come back. She turned to face him, her voice calm but firm. John, I'm doing my best. The food will be ready in a few minutes. Please, just give me a little time. Her response only fueled his irritation, the lingering frustration from their previous argument bubbling to the surface. Always excuses, he muttered, his jaw tightening. You never listen, do you? Everything is always on your terms. Amara straightened, sensing the tension escalating. John, it's not about terms. I'm trying to explain. I don't want your explanations, he interrupted, his voice booming. I'm the husband in this house, Amara. When I speak, you obey. No back talk, no excuses. Amara froze, her eyes widening. The tone of his voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before. John's mind raced, his thoughts flashing back to the conversation at the drinking parlor. The words of the man echoed in his head. Sometimes you have to assert control, even if it means using force. For a moment, his hand twitched at his side as he considered following through. The urge to silence her, to make her obey, gripped him tightly. But Amara, sensing his shift, stepped back slightly, her voice steady. John, we are better than this. I love you, but you can't let anger rule us like this. Her words hung in the air, a quiet plea that fought to penetrate the growing storm within him. John clenched his fists, teetering on the edge of a decision that could change everything. The atmosphere in the kitchen grew tense as John, his anger boiling over, stormed in and grabbed Amara by the arms. His voice thundered. Why can't you do what you're supposed to do? Dinner should have been ready by now. Amara's voice trembled, though she tried to stay calm. John, please, don't do anything you regret. Why are you grabbing me like this? Do you want to beat me? Without another word, John slapped her across the chin. The sound echoed in the confined space of the kitchen, leaving Amara frozen in shock. It wasn't the pain that struck her the most. It was the sheer disbelief. Her eyes widened, not with fear, but with a stunned resolve. Wriggling free from his grip with surprising ease, she stepped back, leaving John momentarily stunned. Without a word, she turned and walked briskly out of the kitchen, heading for the bedroom. Amara shut the bedroom door behind her and slipped out of her gown, pulling on a pair of fitted shorts underneath her top. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was resolute. If John thought she was weak, he was about to learn otherwise. Meanwhile, John paced the kitchen, his anger still burning. He couldn't believe she'd walked away from him like that. "Where did she go?" he muttered, storming out of the kitchen and into the living room. He found Amara standing there, her posture composed, her gaze unwavering. The gown she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by the shorts that hinted at readiness. "What's this?" John sneered, advancing toward her. "You think you can walk away from me?" As he lunged, Amara sidestepped swiftly, her movement calculated and smooth. John barely had time to react before realizing that the wife he underestimated was no longer willing to stand defenseless. John's hand flew through the air with the intent to strike Amara again, his fury unchecked. But Amara, now fully aware of the danger, was ready. In one swift motion, she caught his wrist mid-air, trapping it with a strength that caught him off guard. Before John could react, Amara's fist landed squarely on his lips, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his face. John staggered backward, blinking in confusion and shock. He hadn't expected her to fight back. He hadn't expected her to be this strong. But Amara wasn't done. With the precision of someone who had locally trained in self-defense for years, Amara spun around, ducking under his outstretched arm. Her knee shot up into his guts, forcing the wind out of him. As he gasped for air, she grabbed the broom that stood beside the doorway, wielding it like a weapon.
"John, it needed not to be this way,"
she panted, but there was no mercy in her voice.
"You've chosen this, and now I will show you something you never knew about me."
Before John could recover, Amara struck him across the back with the broomstick, the bristles raking across his skin. He tried to scramble backward, but the pain was overwhelming. As he reached for his shoes to defend himself, Amara kicked them aside, grabbing one and using it to strike him across the face. With every swing, she was relentless, hitting him with the broom, using its handle to knock him back as he tried to evade. Amara's movements were swift and calculated like a trained fighter, each blow landing with precision. She applied a technique she learned years ago in their local wrestling with boys, a swift leg sweep that took John off his feet, sending him crashing to the floor. As he lay sprawled, trying to get away, she followed up with a few rapid punches to his ribs, then slammed the broomstick against his head with enough force to make him dizzy. John, now on the floor, his vision blurry and his body bruised, tried to crawl away. His hands reached out, but Amara stood over him, unwavering. She kicked him with a force that sent a final jolt of pain across his ribs.
"Don't ever think you can do this again,"
she growled, her voice cold and firm.
"You don't get to control me. Not like this. Not ever."
John, beaten and helpless, lay on the floor, unable to defend himself anymore. His body trembled, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the weight of his own realization. The woman he thought he could control had just taught him a painful lesson in strength and resilience. Cletus, who had been relaxing in his room, heard the commotion coming from next door. The loud thuds, the sounds of furniture being knocked over, and the unmistakable voices raised in anger. It didn't take long for him to piece it together. His gut twisted with concern. He knew John and Amara's relationship had been strained for a day or two now. But this was different. Cletus had never heard anything like it before. He could only assume that John had crossed a line he hadn't before, probably hurting Amara. Cletus's suspicion made his blood run cold, and without a second thought, he stood up from his chair and moved toward the door. Slipping on his shoes, Cletus quickly made his way to John's apartment. He wasn't going to let his neighbor's reckless behavior continue. He knew John had been volatile lately, but violence? That was a line that couldn't be crossed. His mind raced with the possibilities. He had to get there before things went too far. As he approached the door, he could hear the faint sounds of struggling and John's voice shouting in frustration. Cletus knocked sharply on the door, hoping to stop whatever madness had overtaken John before it escalated even further. The sounds of the fierce beating had subsided, but just as Amara was catching her breath, she heard the knock on the entrance door. 2 sharp raps. She immediately knew someone had arrived, and it was likely to be a neighbor. Cletus, she guessed. With the tension still thick in the air, Amara quickly formulated her next move. As soon as the door creaked open and Cletus stepped inside, Amara's instinct took over. In a split second, she dropped the broom and the shoe that had been her weapons just moments before, her heart pounding in her chest. She fell to the floor dramatically, her arms flailing in the air as if in distress.
No, help me, Cletus,
she screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice trembling with feigned fear.
John wants to kill me. He's going to hurt me. Somebody help me.
Her dramatic outburst was a calculated act, an effort to ensure that the moment Cletus entered, he would think she was the victim. She threw her arms wide, tears streaming down her face as she continued to scream for help. John, still on the floor, barely recovering from the onslaught Amara had delivered, was stunned into silence. The sudden switch in her behavior took him completely by surprise. For a moment, he couldn't even process what was happening. Was she really going this far to make him look like the villain? Before John could react or defend himself, Cletus had already rushed into the sitting room. His eyes widened as he saw Amara on the floor, her face contorted in terror, her body shaking. She was truly putting on a show, one that Cletus believed without a second thought. "Amara," Cletus said, his voice filled with concern. He rushed toward her and knelt by her side, his protective instincts kicking in. "What happened? What did he do to you?" Without waiting for an answer, Cletus turned his gaze to John, who was still lying on the ground trying to sit up. His eyes burned with anger. "What's this, John?" Cletus demanded, his voice firm and authoritative. "You are attacking your wife? Is this the kind of man you are now? I never thought I'd see the day." John, his body aching and his mind clouded with the after effects of the beating, struggled to stand, but the reality of the situation hit him hard. Amara had outplayed him. He had no words. only a sinking feeling that things had gone horribly wrong. Managing to pull himself up from the floor, John sat slumped on a stool in the corner of the sitting room, his mind swirling in a haze of embarrassment and frustration. His body ached from the beating he'd received, and now his pride was under siege. Across the room, Cletus stood, his voice booming with righteous anger as he directed it toward John. "John, I can't believe this," Cletus shouted, gesturing towards Amara, who was still seated on the floor, feigning helplessness with her hands trembling slightly. "What kind of man raises his hand against his wife? Have you lost your sense? Let me tell you, I won't stand for this nonsense in this compound." John glanced at Amara, whose tear-streaked face seemed to exude innocence. She was playing the role perfectly, and Cletus had clearly fallen for it. A knot tightened in John's chest. He was trapped, and his mind raced with the impossible dilemma before him. Should he tell Cletus the truth? That Amara was the one who had beaten him to a pulp? The thought was mortifying. Admitting that his own wife had overpowered him would tarnish his image, not just before Cletus, but in his own eyes. He couldn't bear the humiliation. But staying silent meant accepting the narrative Amara had crafted. It meant conceding that he was the aggressor, a violent husband who deserved the scolding raining down on him. Either option felt like swallowing shards of glass. "Listen to me, John," Cletus continued, his tone now laced with warning. "If I ever hear or see you lay a finger on Amara again, I will personally have you arrested. I don't think I'll stop there. I'll deal with you the way only a military man can. You hear me?" John nodded slowly, his head lowered. Words failed him. The sharp sting of shame silenced any defense he might have mustered. Cletus leaned in closer. "And let me guess, you've been listening to bad advice, eh? Maybe from drunkards in those beer parlors or gambling center? Let me give you some advice. Stop it now. They will only ruin your life." Still, John said nothing. He only nodded again, each motion a silent admission of defeat. Deep down, he knew Cletus was right. His attempt to exert control over Amara had been a colossal mistake, one that had not only backfired but left him reeling from the consequences. As Cletus straightened up, his voice softened slightly. "You are young couples, John. You have to figure out how to make this marriage work. It's not about who is in charge or who is stronger. It's about understanding each other, being patient, and working together. That's how you build a home." With that, Cletus turned toward Amara. "Amara, I know you are a good woman. Try and manage this man well. Both of you need to sit down and talk things out. Find a way forward." Amara nodded, her expression solemn, though there was a glint of satisfaction in her eyes that John couldn't miss. Finally, Cletus walked to the door, sparing one last look at the couple. "Don't let me hear about this kind of madness again," he said firmly before stepping out and closing the door behind him. The room fell silent. John stayed on the stool, staring at the floor, his thoughts churned with regret, confusion, and a lingering question: where and when his wife learned to fight like that? Amara rose to her feet, dusting herself off.
I'll go and finish preparing the food so that we can have our dinner,
she said as she made her way to the kitchen. About 1 hour later, the egusi soup and pounded yam was ready. John sat across from Amara, quietly eating, his expression unreadable. The earlier tension had waned, leaving behind a delicate stillness in the air. Amara took a deep breath and spoke first, her voice calm but earnest.
John, I want to apologize for earlier. I should have had dinner ready when you got home. I didn't mean to keep you waiting and I'll do better next time. But
She hesitated, carefully choosing her words.
if you know you'll be coming home earlier than usual, could you let me know ahead of time? It will help me plan better.
John glanced at her, his face softening slightly, and gave a small nod. All right. Encouraged, Amara continued, her tone more solemn now.
I also want to say I'm really sorry about what happened today. We shouldn't have fought like that.
She paused, looking at her hands before meeting his eyes again.
And I'm sorry for beating you up. I lost control and I regret it. That's not who I want to be in this marriage.
John shifted in his seat, the weight of her words pressing on him. He didn't interrupt, allowing her to finish.
Please, can we promise each other something?
She asked, her voice soft but firm.
No matter what happens, no matter how upset we get, we will never resort to physical fights again. We can resolve things peacefully, can't we?
John exhaled, leaning back slightly. Her words struck a chord, stirring his lingering guilt and shame. He nodded slowly, finally speaking. Amara, everything is alright now. I know today wasn't great, but we are learning. Every day we are figuring this out, learning about each other, about ourselves, maybe even discovering things we didn't expect. Amara offered a small smile, her relief evident.
Thank you, John.
They finished their meal in relative quiet, a tentative peace settling between them. And so, just as John had learned in a very brutal way that it was a bad idea to follow through with an advice gotten from a drinking parlor, men should also know where to draw the line when it comes to seeking for advice. Just as Cletus said, it could ruin your life. Thank you for watching. See you in our next story.